They said the diner opened early that morning, flag rope clinking in the wind, while an old mechanic sipped from a chipped mug. Across the hangar, a row of cadets mocked his faded uniform, pressed by routine more than malice, just young voices testing silence. The power-flickered lights coughed once, then steadied, revealing a patch on his sleeve glowing like a kept promise. Quietly, the colonel straightened hand to brow. "Let me take you back." The hangar smelled of jet fuel and old coffee, the kind that lingered in metal air long after dawn briefings ended. Rows of cadets stood half at ease, crisp uniforms catching the fluorescent glare. Near the tool bench, Frank Mallory, retired Master Sergeant part-time mechanic 64, and stooped by habit more than age, tightened a panel on the generator. Then he straightened, wiped his hands on a rag, and turned toward them. His coveralls were faded olive, stitched at the shoulder, with a square patch so old the thread had turned the color of parchment. "Hey," a cadet whispered loud enough for echo. "Did the museum let him out for the day?" A ripple of laughter moved down the formation. It wasn't cruel in intent, only careless, the kind of laughter that happens when youth believes it invented competence. Frank heard it. He didn't flinch. He checked the torque wrench again, slow, deliberate, as if tightening something deeper than a bolt. Still, the sound stuck in the rafters. "Another voice, sir. Maybe he lost his invitation to the century." More chuckles. Metal rang as someone set a toolbox too hard on the floor. The vibration ran up the beams, a reminder that everything here was connected, every screw, every tone, every person. Then silence, brief and awkward, the kind that hums before a storm. Frank lifted the coffee mug resting on the wing strut. The mug read, "Base Power Crew, we keep the lights on." He sipped the liquid, lukewarm but steadying. "Lights don't laugh," he said quietly. The words carried farther than he meant. The nearest cadet blinked. Sir Frank smiled faintly. "They just stay on, if you wire 'em right." A few nervous grins faded. Someone cleared his throat. The hangar buzzed again, machines clicking in mechanical heartbeat. Still, the tension stayed, a quiet challenge wrapped in politeness. It pinned them in place, regulation tight, though no one moved. SM lock plus symbolic social pressure, respect awakening. From across the floor came the metallic clink of the colonel's walking cane, a sound like punctuation. The cadets snapped straighter. Frank turned back to his workbench. His hands were steady, his movements precise, the old patch on his sleeve catching the light each time he reached forward. It wasn't decoration. It was a ledger stitched in thread, proof of decades when silence meant everything ran. "Need any help, sir?" when some cadet ventured, voice softer now. He didn't look up. "Only if the power quits." The boy nodded, uncertain. Around them, the hangar hum grew louder, deeper. Then the hum faltered. A flicker. One light, then another dimmed. The laughter that had hung ghost-like in the air died instantly. Frank set down his mug. He glanced once at the ceiling, once at the main switchboard. "Guess the lights heard you," someone whispered. A low pop echoed, bang, metallic. Not violent, just the sound of a system sighing. The whole place shivered. Then the overhead bulbs blinked out in perfect unison, plunging the hangar into darkness. For a breath, no one moved. The only sound was the settling metal and a single bead of coffee rolling off the wing to the floor, plink. And in that darkness, every cadet suddenly remembered who wired the world that kept their uniforms shining. The blackout was total. For a heartbeat, the hangar felt hollow, like a lung that had forgotten how to breathe. Then the alarms began, thin, digital, confused. Emergency strobes pulsed crimson across rows of stunned cadets. "Stay put," someone shouted, though no one knew who. Boots scraped concrete. A wrench rolled somewhere and hit a wall with a hollow clack. Frank Mallory didn't raise his voice. "Hold your ground, boys." He was already moving steady, deliberate toward the breaker panel near the hangar door. The beam from a handheld flashlight wobbled across his shoulders, turning the frayed patch on his sleeve into a small square of history. A cadet tried to follow. "Sir, we're not cleared." "Then don't clear me," Frank said. "Just keep the floor quiet." The young man hesitated halfway between duty and awe. Procedure said, "Wait for command approval, file a fault report, request an engineer." But the old man was the engineer. The voice of regulation hung over them like a ceiling fan about to fall. It slammed every cadet still in place rules, not force protocol, pinning them by the weight of their own training. SM lock plus symbolic equals social pressure, procedure restraint. Frank reached the panel. The casing was warm, humming like a nervous animal. He pressed his palm to it, habit, not superstition, listening through the metal. "Main bus fried," he murmured. "Backup grid asleep." One cadet found his courage. "Should we call maintenance control, Ton?" Frank said, smiling in the half-light. "I am maintenance control." Still, he spoke softly, as though to the machinery itself. "Easy now. Let's see where you tripped." He unlatched the side panel. Sparks didn't fly. Only dust drifted down like snow over the faded label, Primary Feed A. He traced the wiring with his fingerlips moving in quiet arithmetic. Behind him, the cadets exchanged glances. No one dared speak. The crimson strobes painted everything like an old photograph developing in slow chemicals. Frank exhaled. "Reset sequence manual. You'll hear a cough, then a hum." He toggled one lever, paused, then another. The hangar groaned. Somewhere deep in the base, turbines began to whisper. 3, 2, 1. A rising whir. Then light. Fluorescence snapped awake, flooding the room with sterile brilliance. Every face blinked at once as though resurrected. The noise of machinery settled into a clean, confident thrum. No one clapped. They only stared at the old man who stood with one hand still on the panel, the other smoothing his sleeve as if checking for heartbeat. He looked around, gentle and unassuming. "See, told you the lights don't laugh." A few smiles broke through the ranks, uneasy, respectful. The youngest cadet swallowed. "Sir, how'd you know which line failed?" Frank shrugged. She hummed a different note. Silence followed a silent beat so deep they could hear the dust settling back to earth. The hum of restored systems filled the space like forgiveness. He turned away, pocketed his rag, and started back toward the workbench. "Somebody log the reset," he said. "Make sure the colonel gets the right story." No one moved until he passed. When he did, each cadet straightened instinctively, a salute forming. The hum of the restored power still echoed through the hangar. It wasn't loud, but it had a presence steady, forgiving, almost like breath returning after panic. The cadets stood frozen in its rhythm, unsure what to do with their hands. Then came the slow, distinct sound of polished shoes on concrete. Tap, tap, tap. The air seemed to contract with every step. Colonel Harris emerged from the far entrance, hat tucked beneath his arm, the silver on his collar catching the new light. His eyes swept the hangar once power panels, generator faces, and stopped on Frank Mallory. "Report," he said. Frank looked up from the breaker panel, calm as a clock face. "Power fault isolated, sir. Manual reset complete. Recommend full diagnostic before next sortie." The colonel's gaze shifted to the line of cadets, who authorized movement during the outage. No one spoke. A ripple of throats swallowed. The colonel waited silent long enough for discomfort to bloom. Frank broke it with a small nod toward the cadets. They stayed in place, sir. Protocol did the talking. The words landed heavier than they sounded. The younger men and women stiffened again, realizing the depth of what had just happened. Procedure hadn't held them still, respect had. Regulation pinned every cadet still under the weight of awareness, not fear. SM lock plus symbolic equals social disciplinary pressure, not physical force. The colonel's jaw eased. He looked back at Frank. Sergeant Mallory. Retired, sir. Not today. A faint, dry smile ghosted the colonel's face. You just saved our systems with a hand tool and instinct. I think that outranks retirement. Laughter flickered short, uncertain, but it wasn't cruel this time. It was relief wearing humility. Cadets, the colonel said, his voice deepening. On my mark, attention. Boots struck the floor in unison. The echo rolled through the hangar like a wave meeting shore. The colonel faced Frank and without ceremony raised his hand in salute. Every cadet followed. 100 crisp motions, one sound snap. The old mechanic blinked once. For the first time all morning he looked almost uncomfortable. Sir, that's not necessary. It is, the colonel answered. You wired this base to breathe. We just forgot who keeps it alive. The hangar held its breath. The salute remained not forced, not ceremonial, but honest. The patch on Frank's sleeve caught the fluorescent light again, and this time it glowed, not faded. A moment passed. But no one laughed now. The silence became its own applause. Even the machines seemed to idle softer as though listening. The colonel lowered his hand first, then nodded once. Carry on. Frank gave a quiet yes, sir, and turned back to tidy the open panel. The cadets didn't move until he did. From the mezzanine window, sunlight pushed through the high glass panes, striking the concrete in perfect rectangles. It felt like something larger than electricity had been restored. Shorts to moment number 2 equals wide shot. The colonel's salute under white light, cadets aligned in reverent stillness, halfway before dying into still respect. The next morning, sunlight came through the high windows like clean water after a storm. The hangar was quieter now, the machines sleeping in orderly rows. The night crew had swept away the dust, and the story had already started to spread, an old mechanic, a blackout, a salute. Frank Mallory arrived before anyone else. He carried the same mug, same rag, same steady gait that looked like time itself had to adjust around him. On the workbench lay the worn patch he'd pulled loose from his sleeve the night before, threadbare edges curled, colors softened to memory. He placed it beside his wrench set like a relic laid down for inspection. Then footsteps again. Slower this time. No parade ground cadence, just weight and purpose. Morning, Sergeant. The colonel's voice filled the empty space the way sunlight filled the floor. Frank turned, wiping his hands automatically. Morning, sir. Power's holding steady. So I've heard. The colonel stopped near the generator. Base maintenance says we owe you about 1 million kilowatts of gratitude. Frank smiled. Make it half a cup of decent coffee and we're square. The colonel chuckled. Coffee's free when the power works. Humor light. They both stood there for a moment, listening to the low hum. It wasn't just machinery now. It was proof that calm hands mattered. The colonel's tone shifted. You know, last night after you left, I kept thinking about that patch. He nodded toward the bench. What's the story behind it? Frank picked it up carefully. It's from my first tour. Communications unit. We didn't get medals. We got circuits to keep alive. Every time a tower held through a storm, someone sewed a line of silver thread in here. After a while, it looked like lightning. He turned it over. One day, the threads started to fade. Figured that meant the storms were someone else's to handle. The colonel studied the small square, the years etched into every fiber. Then he said quietly, "Would you consider letting the academy display it? We could mount it on the honor board, call it the Mallory patch." Frank shook his head once instinctively. "Sir, that's not a museum piece. It's just work cloth. That's exactly why it belongs there." The colonel's eyes softened. Cadets see enough gold braid. They need to see the color of persistence. The old man didn't answer. He looked at the patch, then at the younger officer standing with the same reverence usually reserved for flags and folded letters. The air between them felt heavy but not burdensome, the kind of weight that presses humility into shape, not submission. SM lock plus symbolic pressure equals respect transfer. Finally, Frank nodded. "All right, but you hang it where the light hits it only in the morning. It was never meant to shine all day." The colonel smiled. "Deal." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small glass frame. "Had the quartermaster run this overnight. Thought you'd change your mind. You always plan ahead like that, sir, only when I hope to be wrong." He set the frame on the bench. The glass caught the sunlight, bending it into gold across the concrete. Frank slipped the patch inside. For a second, his reflection merged with the threads, gray hair, steady hands, the echo of a younger self soldering wires in a desert wind. Then he closed the latch. Symbolic turn, complete the patch, now part of something larger, no longer possession but testimony. Across the hangar, cadets began filtering in for morning formation. Conversations stopped when they saw the two men by the workbench. No orders had been given, but everyone slowed their pace, sensing ceremony. The colonel lifted the frame, holding it chest high. Cadets, attention. Boots aligned, breath held. The hum of the generators lowered itself like a background choir. "This," he said, "is what keeps us running. Not the power lines, not the protocols, the hands that know when to listen to a hum and when to trust silence." He turned toward Frank. "You taught that lesson without meaning to. We intend to keep teaching it with your permission." Frank gave a small nod, eyes on the floor. "Long as they remember, it's not about who fixed what. It's about who stayed when it went dark." The colonel faced the cadets again. "Understood." He set the frame on a stand near the entrance. "Every time you pass this, think of that night. And remember, lights don't laugh, but they do listen." A low murmur rippled through the ranks. Respect, quiet, and contagious. The colonel looked back to Frank. "You'll join us for the ceremony this weekend. Wouldn't miss it. Someone's got to make sure your wiring's right." Laughter broke gently, like glass chimes in a breeze, warm, neighborly, unforced. For a brief second, both men stood in the same rectangle of light. One passing legacy, the other receiving it not by speech, but by presence. The moment held 2 minutes of pure equilibrium before the hangar noise slowly returned. When the cadets filed out, the colonel remained. He took one last sip of the now cold coffee Frank had left behind and set the mug next to the frame. Then he whispered almost to himself, "Power's good." Frank's voice floated back from the doorway. "Keep it that way, sir." And the colonel smiled, because for the first time since he'd worn his bars, he realized leadership could be as quiet as maintenance. The diner was louder than usual, the clatter of breakfast plates mingling with the hiss of the coffee machine and the steady hum of a jukebox that had seen too many decades. The morning sun spilled across the window blinds, painting stripes on the counter, where half a dozen cadets crowded around a booth. They weren't laughing the way they used to. The energy was different, softer, thoughtful. On the wall above them hung a framed photo, the hangar bathed in light, the colonel mid-salute, and beside him the old mechanic whose patch now lived under glass at the academy gate. One cadet stirred his coffee and said, "You ever think he planned that, like let the lights fail just to teach us something?" Another shook his head. "You can't plan silence like that. It just happens when you've done the work long enough." The waitress slid by with a grin. "You boys talking about the power man again? He's been coming here since I was your age. Same order, same booth, never a word wasted." She poured refills before they could answer. The bell over the door jingled, and the colonel stepped in, not in uniform this time, just a man in a plain shirt carrying the same weight of command in his shoulders. Conversations dimmed out of habit more than fear. He nodded to the waitress and gestured toward the far wall where the photo hung. "You folks noticed they finally lit that patch display," he said. The cadets straightened. "Sir, it's brighter than anything else in the hall." The colonel smiled. "That's because someone asked for morning light only. Guess he knew best." A soft round of laughter moved through the room. It wasn't sharp or mocking then, someone laughed not unkindly, and the sound settled into the hum of the diner, like an old melody rediscovered. One cadet looked down at his own sleeve where a new training patch was stitched, and tapped it gently, as if testing its heartbeat. "Sir, do you think he'll come by?" "He already did," the waitress said, pointing with her chin. In the far booth near the window, Frank Mallory sat alone with his mug reading an old newspaper folded neat into thirds. The light caught his glasses, a flash of morning silver. He raised the mug slightly in acknowledgement, not greeting, just quiet presence. The colonel returned the gesture, nothing formal, nothing forced. Around them, the diner resumed its rhythm, the scrape of forks, the low murmur of small talk, the distant whistle of a freight train heading east. A moment later, the jukebox clicked to a new song, an old one about promises kept. The cadets listened without realizing they were doing it, each hearing the refrain differently. Outside, through the front window, the camera of memory could have caught it all, the photo on the wall, the patch glowing softly beneath morning sun. The colonel smiling into his coffee, and Frank looking out past the glass, as if checking one last system before going home. The ceremony took place 3 days later, the kind of autumn morning that felt both crisp and forgiving. The academy courtyard was lined with folding chairs, the air humming with choir rehearsals drifting from the chapel across the field. Flags lifted and settled in the same slow rhythm as breath. Cadets stood in neat formation, their new patches sewn bright and fresh. At the center of the courtyard, under the soft curve of a temporary awning, the framed relic waited, the Mallory patch, its silver threads alive again in the sunlight. The colonel stepped to the podium, but didn't speak right away. He looked over the faces, then toward the front row, where Frank sat beside the maintenance crew, sleeves rolled, cap in his lap. The colonel said, "There are lessons we learn in classrooms, and then there are lessons we earn when the lights go out." A murmur passed through the crowd. "This patch," he continued, "is a story of work done right, of humility that doesn't fade. You see it every morning when you walk past the gate. You just don't always notice." He paused, letting silence do the explaining. Frank shifted in his chair, uneasy under attention, his hands folded like spare tools. When the colonel finished, the choir began a slow, wordless tune, part hymn, part radio static. The sound filled every empty corner until even the flag seemed to move in time. A cadet stepped forward carrying a plaque with a new inscription for the hands that kept the current steady. The colonel beckoned Frank. The old man stood moving with the stiffness of a man unused to stages. Applause rose low at first, then stronger. Not the sharp clapping of celebration, but the soft, rhythmic gratitude of people who finally understood. Sir Frank said quietly that patch belongs to all of us. Exactly, the colonel replied. Which is why your name's not on it. Laughter rippled, gentle earned. Frank's eyes lingered on the plaque. The reflection of the flagpole flickered across the glass like a live current. He thought of the blackout, of the young faces frozen in procedure, of how quickly noise becomes silence when someone listens first. He stepped back, hands slipping into his pockets. The choir's hum deepened the notes vibrating through the metal folding chairs. A gust of wind caught the edges of the flag, making it snap softly before settling again. The ceremony closed without fanfare. People dispersed, leaving behind the faint scent of coffee and warm circuits. Frank walked toward the gate, passing the plaque once more. He paused, resting a fingertip against the glass. The surface was cool, steady. Respect runs on quiet circuits, he murmured. That's how the lights stay on. The line was half prayer, half engineering truth. He looked once more at the courtyard, at the cadets, laughing in the distance, not mockery this time, just youth. The wind carried the sound upward until it mixed with the final bars of the choir. Then came stillness, radio static fading into sky flag, whispering above the hum of restored power.